The vibration begins not in the ears, but in the marrow of the bone. It is a low-frequency thrum that rattles the teeth of every man shivering on the western bank of the Rhine. The date is March 7, 1945. The air at Remagen is a thick, choking soup of river mist, pulverized masonry, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Through the gloom, the silhouettes appear, massive, low-slung, and predatory.
These are the T-26E3 Pershings of the Zebra mission.
46 tons of dark olive-drab steel represent the 11th hour culmination of 3 years of bureaucratic infighting and industrial desperation. As the American tankers lumber toward the Ludendorff Bridge, the last skeletal finger of black iron reaching across the water into the heart of the Reich, the heavy clatter of German demolition teams echoes from the far side. It is a frantic percussion of hammers and wires. The Pershing's 90mm gun swings its long, counterweighted snout toward the stone towers. This weapon was designed to finally end the reign of the Tiger. The bridge groans under the weight of the tanks and the concussive force of German 105mm shells erupting in the water. Geysers of freezing mud spray into the air. This is the endgame. The entire Allied war effort rests on a few precarious spans of timber and steel. But to understand how we arrived at this riverbank, we must look back to the deceptive isolationist silence of a decade prior. Before the thunder of the 90mm gun, there was only the rhythmic clip-clop of horse cavalry. The American military was clinging to a dead era. In the 1930s, the United States Army was a ghost. It was a 17th-ranked global power, haunted by the skeletal remains of World War I tanks and erratic, unreliable hangar queens. Officers faced a psychological crisis. They were forced to choose between the romantic heritage of the equestrian tradition or the cold, grease-stained reality of a mechanized future. This complacency was first jolted by the crucible of the Spanish Civil War. The staccato chatter of machine gun-only armor was silenced by the grim necessity of the dual-purpose gun. But the true shattering of the American psyche came with the French earthquake of 1940. In a cinematic 6-week collapse, the perceived best army in the world was vaporized by the iron backbone of the German blitzkrieg. The shockwaves hit Washington like a physical blow. The old branch distinctions were suddenly obsolete. In July 1940, amidst the panic, the armored force was born. Leaders like Abner Chaffee began the Herculean task of institutionalizing mechanized tactics. Men like George S. Patton transitioned from the polo fields to the turret. They were bridging the gap from cavalry to steel. The early days were a mechanical mess. Tankers struggled with light tanks, nicknamed Mae Wests for their twin-turreted rounded silhouettes. These machines were temperamental beasts that broke down so frequently that staying operational for a full day was considered a minor miracle. Yet, while the soldiers wrestled with unreliable engines in the dust of Kentucky, a different kind of awakening was occurring in the American Midwest. Under the direction of K.T. Keller at Chrysler, the Detroit tank arsenal underwent a metamorphosis. This would redefine the conflict as a war of the machines. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the facility employed a mere 230 workers. Within a year, that number surged to 5,000. Railroad production lines were ripped out to make way for high-speed engines of war. The air in Detroit grew thick with the smell of hot oil and the deafening roar of pneumatic riveters. This mobilization would eventually produce over 25,000 tanks. It was a staggering output that matched the entire industrial might of the German Reich combined. This was a transition from a country club military culture to an unrivaled industrial titan. The tension between rigid design and the brutal requirements of the battlefield would eventually lead those steel giants to the mud-slicked banks of the Rhine. But first, the machines had to face the desert. The abrasive, fine-grained dust of the western desert doesn't just coat the skin. It migrates into the eyes, the lungs, and the very gears of the machines. In May 1942, near the Gazala line in Egypt, British tankers stand in the shadow of a mechanical contradiction. It is the M3 Medium, a towering 10-foot-tall slab of riveted steel that the Americans have rushed into their hands. One sergeant runs a gloved hand over the hull, feeling the heat radiating from the metal. To the British, this is the Grant. To the Americans, it is the Lee. But as the crew looks up at the three-tiered weapon system, they do not see a modern tank. They see a land battleship. It is an iron cathedral that offers a profile so high it can be spotted by a German gunner from miles away across the shimmering heat haze of the Sahara. The interior is a cramped, oily labyrinth where 7 men are expected to fight in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees. The 75mm main gun is trapped in a side sponson, unable to rotate. To aim it, the entire tank must be wrenched around in the sand. It is a clumsy, grinding dance of tracks and dust. Yet, for all its design flaws, the engine roars with a reliability the British haven't seen in their own machines. It is a stopgap and a desperate industrial bridge. But as the first German shells begin to clang against the armour, the crews discover a terrifying secret. Where a high-velocity round strikes the hull, the shock shears the internal rivets off like steel bullets. The fighting compartment becomes a lethal shredder of flying bolts. To the Soviet crews who would later receive them, the M3 is already known by a darker name. They call it a grave for 7 brothers. While these steel giants are being baptized in the Egyptian fire, the man pulling the strings of American doctrine sits in a sterile office thousands of miles away. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the architect of the Army Ground Forces, is a man of rigid mathematical certainty. He envisions a battlefield of specialized roles. He creates a tank destroyer doctrine that treats armored warfare like a game of high-stakes chess. In the mind of McNair, tanks are not meant to fight other tanks. They are mobile exploitation tools meant to harass infantry and punch through gaps. If German panzers appear, they are to be handled by a specialized elite. The Tank Destroyer Command would operate thin-skinned, high-speed vehicles designed to seek, strike, and destroy. This theory, born in the country club atmosphere of stateside maneuvers, ignores the chaotic reality of the front. It leaves American tankers equipped with a 37mm gun. McNair believes this weapon is sufficient. But frontline crews are already beginning to call it a pea-shooter. This institutional complacency is about to collide with the veteran lethality of the German Afrika Korps. The disaster is waiting in a mountain pass in Tunisia. The morning of February 20th, 1943, at the Kasserine Pass, is defined by a biting horizontal wind that carries the scent of wild rosemary and impending disaster. For the green American troops of the 1st Armored Division, the romanticized cavalry training of Fort Knox is vaporizing in the face of a blast furnace reality. Lieutenant Robert Hightower peers through his periscope, his breath fogging the cold glass. He watches as a wave of German panzers, led by the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel himself, emerges from the purple shadows of the Atlas Mountains. The Americans attempt to hold a static line, a defense that the Germans simply bypass and envelop, with practiced, predatory ease. The air is suddenly filled with the supersonic crack of the German 88mm guns. These are weapons that can core an American tank from 2 miles away. Hightower feels the floor of his tank lurch as a 37mm shell from his own line strikes a panzer and simply skips off the turret like a pebble across a pond. The realization is a physical blow to the stomach. They are outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. The pass becomes a graveyard of charred olive-drab hulls and the acrid stench of burning rubber. Men who weeks ago were enjoying the quiet life of the rear are now scrambling through the scrub brush, their ears ringing from the concussive force of rocket fire that sounds like screaming memes. This is the Desert Awakening, a catastrophic failure of doctrine that leaves 6,000 Americans dead, wounded, or captured. As the survivors retreat toward the Algerian border, their faces etched with the hollow stare of the shell-shocked, the myth of American technical superiority lies shattered in the Tunisian mud. The Iron Cathedral has fallen, and the United States Army is forced to realize that the war will not be won with theories, but with the hard-won, bloody evolution of a machine that can actually survive. But to understand this slaughter, we must look at the most ruthless enemy on the battlefield, the tyranny of time. By the spring of 1943, the United States Army is trapped in a bureaucratic amber of its own making. The M4 Sherman had arrived like a savior at El Alamein, but in the air-conditioned corridors of Washington, that success has curdled into a dangerous complacency. This is the era of the battle-need philosophy, a doctrine enforced with religious fervor by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. To McNair, the Sherman is not a machine to be perfected. It is a logistical unit to be mass-produced. He views the battlefield through the cold lens of a statistician, believing that any delay for a future threat is a betrayal of the men currently in the mud. He is locked in a silent, bitter war of wills with Major General Gladian Barnes of the Ordnance Department. Barnes is a man often accused of being a mad scientist, constantly pushing for heavier guns and thicker armor plates. While Barnes dreams of the next generation, McNair issues a chilling mandate: no new equipment will be authorized until the current hardware is proven, through blood, to be insufficient. It is a reactive, rather than proactive, death sentence. The cost of this stagnation is measured in the acrid, sweet, sickly smell of burning propellant that haunts the recovery yards of North Africa. Inside a blackened, turretless hull resting in a Tunisian wadi, an ordnance officer named Major William Sylvan wipes a layer of greasy soot from his goggles. The air inside the tank is thick with the scent of charred upholstery and something far worse. For months, the Sherman has been earning a terrifying nickname among its crews, the Romson, after the cigarette lighter that lights the first time every time. The Germans have a more clinical term, the Tommy Cooker. The prevailing myth is that the Sherman's gasoline engine is a rolling tinderbox, but as Sylvan pokes a flashlight into the sponsons, he sees the true culprit. The floor is littered with the brass casings of 75mm shells, their sides peeled open like overripe fruit. When a German high-velocity round punches through the thin side armor, it doesn't just hit the engine, it sprays white-hot sparks into these unprotected ammunition bins. The propellant ignites instantly, turning the fighting compartment into a high-pressure furnace that incinerates the crew before they can even reach for the hatches. Sylvan and his team realize that the Romson reputation isn't a failure of fuel, but of physics. They begin to sketch a desperate, brilliant innovation called wet stowage. They envision surrounding the ammunition racks with a mixture of water, glycerin, and a rust inhibitor.
It is a simple, visceral solution. If a shell is struck, the liquid douses the flash, buying the crew the 5 or 10 seconds of life they need to scramble out of the steel trap.
It is a rare moment of technical agility, a shift toward crew survivability that will eventually drop the fire rate of hit Shermans from 80% to less than 15%. But while the wet fix addresses the fire, it does nothing to address the gun. As 1943 turns to 1944, a deeper, more catastrophic intelligence gap begins to widen. In the country club atmosphere of high command, the Sherman is still considered the king of the battlefield because it has spent a year bullying the aging German tanks of the Mediterranean. Reports begin to filter in from the Eastern Front, frantic, detailed accounts from Soviet allies of a new German beast called the Panther. It has a long 75mm high-velocity gun that can pierce a Sherman from 2 miles out, and a sloped frontal plate that no American gun can touch. But in Washington, these reports are treated as rare special assets, outliers of a crumbling German industry that surely cannot mass-produce such a complex machine. This illusion of superiority is nearly shattered in a quiet field outside of Rome, where a group of Allied officers stands before a captured abandoned Panther. The tank is a physical manifestation of everything the Sherman is not: low, wide, and draped in thick, predatory armor. One American colonel kicks the massive overlapping road wheels and scoffs, noting how the mud of Italy would surely clog such a feudal, over-engineered design. He dismisses the Panther as a niche weapon that the Americans will simply bypass with their nimble, reliable Shermans. They look at the massive German gun, and then back at their own short-barreled weapons, and they choose to believe their own propaganda. The battle need has been satisfied, the logistical lines are set, and the boxy workhorse is deemed sufficient. The Americans are preparing to invade Fortress Europe with a 1942 solution to a 1944 problem. They are blissfully unaware that the rare Panther is already being manufactured by the thousands. It is waiting in the hedgerows of Normandy to turn the tyranny of time into a slaughter. The humidity of Normandy in June 1944 is a physical weight. It is a wet blanket of salt air and the rot of ancient vegetation that clings to the skin of every man trapped in the green hell of the bocage. For the American tankers, the pastoral beauty of the French countryside has been exposed as a lethal, multi-layered fortress. A hedgerow here is not a simple garden fence. It is a 1,000-year-old embankment of stone and tangled roots, 10 feet thick and topped with hawthorn so dense it swallows the sun. Every field is a kill sack. It is a natural ambush zone where a single German 75mm gun, hidden in the shadows of a sunken road, can wait in predatory silence. When an American Sherman attempts to breach these earthen walls, its nose climbs toward the sky. This movement exposes the thin, unarmored, soft underbelly of the hull to the enemy. It is a moment of agonizing vulnerability. The tank becomes a belly-up turtle, its tracks churning uselessly in the air, until a German round punches through the floor and turns the interior into a furnace. High-level planners in London had obsessed over the logistics of the beach landings, but they never accounted for this terrain. They had no answers. The offensive is grinding to a halt. The maps are turning red with casualties, and the Great Crusade is being strangled by a landscape that refuses to let the machines move. But the solution does not come from a Pentagon committee or a Detroit drawing board. It comes from the grease-stained hands of a sergeant named Curtis C. Cullen. In a makeshift repair depot behind the lines, the air is thick with the acrid metallic tang of arc welding and the blue haze of tobacco smoke. Cullen is a former taxi driver from New Jersey with a mind for jagged ingenuity. He stands before a pile of twisted scrap metal known as Rommel's asparagus. These were the heavy steel beams the Germans had planted on the beaches to impale landing craft. Cullen is not looking for a sophisticated engineering feat. He is looking for a way to turn the Sherman into a butcher. Using a handheld torch, he and his crew begin to fashion 4 jagged, tusk-like blades from the scavenged steel. They weld them directly to the front differential housing of a Sherman restaurant. They call it the salad fork. It is a Frankenstein's monster of an attachment that looks more like a medieval siege engine than a modern tank. On July 14, 1944, Cullen climbs into the turret of his modified tank and signals the driver. The engine roars and the tank lunges forward. Instead of climbing the hedgerow, the rhino blades bite deep into the ancient earth. With a violent, bone-shaking jolt, the tank shears through the roots and stone. It erupts through the other side of the embankment in a cloud of dirt and splintered wood. It is a bottom-up revolution. Within days, the order goes out to every maintenance battalion in Normandy to scavenge every piece of beach scrap they can find. The Sherman is no longer a country club machine. It is a mud-caked bulldozer of war, and the hedgerow hell finally begins to crack open. But as the Americans break out of the bocage and into the open plains of France, the Rhino innovation is immediately shadowed by a cold, technical terror. In late July, at a clinical, high-stakes testing ground near the town of Isigny, the illusion of American firepower is systematically dismantled. Allied officers stand in a semicircle with their notebooks ready as a captured German Panther is placed in the center of a field. A brand-new Sherman is brought forward, equipped with the 76mm Wonder Gun. This was the weapon that was supposed to be the answer to German heavy armor. The gunner takes aim from 400 yards and fires. The supersonic crack of the 76mm echoes across the field, but instead of the expected explosion, there is only the sickening metallic clang of failure. The shell strikes the sloped frontal plate of the Panther and simply shatters. Its fragments skip off into the grass like useless pebbles. They fire again at 200 yards. Then they fire at 100 yards. The result is exactly the same. The weapon they have bet the lives of their crews on is ballistically incapable of penetrating the front of the primary enemy tank. The Panther panic spreads through the ranks like a virus. General Eisenhower is reportedly livid, seething that he was the last to be told that his tanks were outclassed. The realization is absolute. The United States Army is fighting a high-velocity war with a low-velocity philosophy. The only way to survive is to stop playing by the enemy's rules. This desperation culminates in the rolling, fog-drenched hills of the Lorraine in September 1944. Near the town of Aricourt, the see first, hit first rule of armored combat is written in blood. The morning of September 19th is a claustrophobic soup of grey mist. Visibility is reduced to a mere 150 yards. This is a natural equalizer that neutralizes the German advantage in long-range gunnery. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams is a man who fights with a cigar clamped between his teeth and a visceral hatred for static defense. He directs his battalion through the gloom. He does not wait for a formal line of battle. He uses the superior agility of the Sherman and its faster turret traverse to turn the engagement into a street fight in the open fields. Suddenly, the silhouette of a Panther emerges from the fog, its long 75mm gun swings, slowly and blindly, searching for a target. The American crew does not hesitate. They have learned that against a Panther, you do not aim for the front, you dance. The engine of the Sherman screams as it pivots. The tank flanks the German behemoth before that sluggish, engine-dependent turret can even track the movement. At point-blank range, The 75mm gun barks once. The shell punches through the thin side armor of the Panther. The German tank erupts into a spectacular brew-up as the turret is lifted off its ring by the internal explosion of its own ammunition. This is the Arakourt pivot. It is a masterclass in combined arms fluidity. As the fog begins to lift, the impersonal menace of Allied air power takes over. The low-frequency thrum of P-47 Thunderbolts breaks the tension of the morning. From the perspective of the German crews, the sky itself has turned hostile. The Shermans on the ground act as the anvil, flushing the Panthers into the open. The Thunderbolts dive from the clouds, their rockets and 50-caliber fire turning the German brigades into a graveyard of burning steel. By the time the smoke clears, the Germans have lost 86 tanks. The Americans have lost only 25. Arakourt proves that while the Panther is the superior machine, the American combat team is the superior system. The war has moved past the kindergarten mistakes of North Africa. The United States Army has finally learned to weaponize its own industrial and tactical flexibility. They have turned a technically inferior tank into the relentless engine of the German Reich's destruction. The silence of the Ardennes in early December 1944 is a deceptive, predatory thing. It is a world of muffled sounds. The soft crunch of frozen pine needles under a boot, the rhythmic metallic tink-tink of a cooling engine, and the low, heavy breathing of men shivering in slit trenches. This is the Ghost Front, a stretch of the line so quiet it has become a dumping ground for the weary and the untested. The air is a biting cocktail of damp wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of a looming snowstorm. In the command trailers of the American First Army, the atmosphere is one of country club complacency. Allied intelligence, blinded by the assumption that the enemy is as exhausted as they are, has convinced itself that the German Wehrmacht is a spent force. They project their own logistical exhaustion onto the enemy, assuming that because the Allies are low on fuel and winter gear, the Germans must be paralyzed. They are oblivious to the fact that just beyond the mist-shrouded tree line, 28 German divisions are holding their breath. Their new Panthers and King Tigers are draped in white sheets, their crews fueled by a frantic final dose of ideological desperation. When the silence finally shatters at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, it doesn't break with a bang, but with a heavy concussion that vibrates the very earth of the Losheim Gap. The horizon erupts in a flickering glow of German searchlights bouncing off the low clouds, creating an artificial ghostly moonlight that silhouettes the advancing steel. For the American tankers, a hollow, wide-eyed shock sets in as the propaganda they were fed in training evaporates. The American tank destroyers find themselves in a grimly comical nightmare. Their 3-inch towed guns, monstrosities weighing 2 tons, are trapped in the freezing mud, unable to pivot as German armor bypasses them in the fog. Within 48 hours, 31 of their 36 guns are abandoned, reduced to twisted scrap by a doctrine that prioritized static defense over mobile reality. As the blast furnace of the Bulge rages, the cynical reality of the front line finally reaches the ears of Dwight D. Eisenhower in the form of the White Report. It is a devastating document, a collection of unfiltered, visceral testimony from crews who feel they are being murdered by technical stagnation. The boosterism of the Ordnance Department is dismantled by the jagged, bitter words of men who have seen the truth. One sergeant recounts the psychological horror of watching 7 of his armor-piercing rounds strike a Panther and simply shatter like glass. His own tank vibrated with the ricochets of enemy fire that felt like supersonic ping-pong balls. The report exposes a systemic failure. While the Navy and Air Force were allowed to build for the future threat, the Army tankers were shackled to a mandate that left them fighting a 1945 war with 1942 armor. This technical disparity is crystallized in a freezing tree line near the village of Crinkled Rocherath. Sergeant Joe Miller peers through the periscope of his M4A3, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from the sight of a king tiger emerging from the swirling snow.
The German behemoth is a terrifying iron cathedral of sloped 80mm steel.
Its long 88mm gun searches the fog like the snout of a predator. Miller knows the math. His 75mm gun is a pea shooter against that frontal plate. At 600 yards, Miller watches his first round skip off the Tiger's armor with a sickening clang that echoes through the valley. The Tiger begins to traverse its turret with a slow, hydraulic growl that sounds like a death sentence. Miller screams for his loader to shove a white phosphorus shell into the breach. The Willie Pete is not a tank-killing round. It is a chemical nightmare. The Sherman barks and the shell strikes the face of the Tiger. It does not penetrate. Instead, it erupts in a spectacular, blinding fountain of white-hot fire and acrid, sizzling smoke. The phosphorus sticks to the Tiger's vision blocks and is sucked into the engine intakes. It fills the German fighting compartment with a suffocating, garlic-scented fog that mimics the smell of a catastrophic internal explosion. Through his periscope, Miller sees the German hatches fly open. The crew, panicked by the illusion that their tank is an inferno, scrambles out into the snow. They are cut down by the Sherman's .50 caliber machine gun before they even hit the ground. It is a victory of jagged ingenuity over hardware parity. It was a desperate, improvised tactic born of the realization that survival depends on blinding the monster you cannot kill. Miller's crew sits in the shivering silence of their own tank, the smell of cordite and ozone thick in the air. They have survived the minute, but the white report remains unread on the desks of the rear echelon, and the long winter of the Reich's final gamble is only just beginning. Now we return to the mud of Remagen, where the Pershing tanks of the Zebra mission face the Ludendorff Bridge. It is March 7, 1945, and the air is a suffocating cocktail of wet stone and the acrid stench of explosives. For the men of the 14th Tank Battalion, the sight of the bridge, still standing despite the frantic German attempts to blow it, is a miracle wrapped in a death trap. Sergeant Robert Early sits in the commander's cupola of his Pershing, his knuckles white as he grips the periscope. This is the machine they were promised years ago. It is a 46-ton beast with the low, predatory silhouette of a panther and the supersonic rapier of a 90mm gun. Inside, the fighting compartment feels different than the Sherman. It is heavier, more industrial, a killer tank finally built to the scale of the enemy. The bridge groans under the weight of a massive, botched demolition charge that sends a plume of black smoke into the sky. Early signals his gunner. The 90mm barks with a heavy, rhythmic thrum that vibrates through the steel floor and into the soles of his boots. Across the river, German snipers and flak crews are systematically erased by the high-velocity shells. This is the suppressive fire the infantry needs. As the American soldiers begin their desperate, sprinting suicide run across the planks, the Pershings act as the steel backbone of the assault. Their heavy armor soaks up hits that would have turned a Sherman into a burning coffin. When the first American tank finally rolls onto the far bank, it is a victory that comes too late for the thousands of crews already buried in the hedgerows of France. But for the men at Remagen, the technological gap has finally, violently, been closed. The Zebra mission proved that the United States could build a monster, but as the bridge finally collapses into the Rhine 10 days later, it serves as a tombstone for the era of the heavy breakthrough tank. The war was not won by this handful of Pershings. It was won by the 49,000 Shermans that had already ground the Wehrmacht into the dust. The Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it was the tank that stayed in the fight until the very end. The final weeks of the conflict are a cinematic blur of industrial power. This was a high-speed mechanical endgame, where the Sherman acted as the tireless workhorse of the armored corps, often outrunning its own supply lines. The persistent myth that it took 5 Shermans to destroy a single German Panther begins to dissolve under the cold light of statistical reality. Victory did not come from matching the German iron cathedrals plate for plate. Instead, it was the result of a superior integrated system of mass production and logistical reliability. The Americans relied on a doctrine of seeing the enemy first and hitting them first. By the time the guns fall silent in May 1945, the United States Army has completed a total transformation. It had evolved from an isolationist relic of horse cavalry into an unrivaled industrial titan. But as the victory parades fade, a different kind of tragedy begins to unfold. This was the era of the memory hole. The history of these machines was systematically scrubbed from the record. While the Air Force polished its flying fortresses into gleaming icons of the war, the Army viewed its combat-hardened Shermans as nothing more than obsolete industrial scrap. In the mud-slicked depots of occupied Germany and the field foundries of Belgium, thousands of tanks are lined up like condemned prisoners. These were machines that carried proud names like Major Jim, Cobra King, and Thunderbolt 6. Now, the air is filled with the rhythmic screaming hiss of cutting torches. The very steel that liberated a continent is sliced into manageable chunks for the furnace. The Cobra King, the famous jumbo Sherman that broke the siege of Bastogne, is stripped of its identity. Its chalk markings are washed away by the rain until it stands as an anonymous rusting gate guard in a forgotten motor pool. The true human cost is preserved only in the illicit, grainy snapshots tucked into the footlockers of the veterans. These are men who still carry the hollow stare of combat and the phantom smell of cordite in their nostrils. They remember the sizzling hot terror of a shell penetrating their armor. They remember the heavy concussion of a near miss. They remember the bureaucratic failures that forced them to weld sandbags to their hulls just to feel a sense of safety against the German 88mm. The Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it was the tank that stayed in the fight until the very end. It stands as a testament to an industrial mobilization that turned the American Midwest into the arsenal of democracy. As the last of the scrap heaps are melted down, only the stories remain. The world is left with the visceral reality of the men who lived, fought, and died in the Steel Man. They overcame the tyranny of time to emerge from the shadow of their own obsolescence.
If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video.
And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.